It usually starts with confidence. The kind of confidence that doesn't ask questions because it already thinks it knows the answers. The kind that smiles politely while silently ranking itself higher. And in this case, it starts with Americans stepping onto British soil or into British conversations, convinced they're about to explain the world to people who, in their minds, are a few steps behind. Except what they don't realize is that Britain has been quietly watching, listening, and waiting. And when it backfires spectacularly. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe, like my video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. There's a certain myth that floats around, unspoken but deeply felt, that America is the final evolution. Bigger, louder, faster, more advanced. That British people are charming but outdated, clever with accents but stuck in the past, sipping tea while the rest of the world moves forward. And so, when Americans arrive, whether physically or digitally, they often bring that mindset with them. Not aggressively, not always rudely, just confidently, dangerously confidently. It shows up in small moments first. An American tourist in London laughs when a British waiter says maths instead of math, correcting him with a grin like he's doing a favor. A student on a study abroad program explains to their British classmates how the American Revolution was inevitable because Britain was tyrannical and backward, pausing for approval that never comes. An online debate erupts where an American insists the US education system is superior because it's more modern, completely missing the expressions on the faces across the screen. The backfire doesn't happen immediately. That's the trick. The British response is rarely loud. There's no shouting match, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, there's a pause, a subtle smile, a raised eyebrow, a carefully chosen sentence that sounds harmless but lands like a chess move 3 turns ahead. Take the classic moment when an American proudly announces that Americans speak real English, and British English is just the old version. It sounds logical if you don't think too hard, until a Brit gently asks why American spelling removes letters but insists it's more efficient, while still pronouncing words like colonel and lieutenant in ways that make no phonetic sense. Or until someone casually points out that the English language didn't originate in North America, and that Americans didn't simplify English so much as aggressively remix it. The American laughs it off at first, but then the examples keep coming. Aluminium versus aluminum. Schedule pronounced 2 different ways. Entire words Americans think are British slang that turn out to be global terms, older than the United States itself. Suddenly, the joke isn't landing the way it was supposed to. This is where British wit begins to do what it does best. It doesn't attack head-on. It circles. It lets the other person talk themselves into a corner. When an American brags about never needing a passport because the US is so big and diverse, a Brit might respond with something like, "That's fascinating. So how many countries have you been to?" And when the answer is a hesitant number, followed by a justification about distance or cost, the silence that follows says everything. Americans often underestimate how much history Britain carries quietly. Not in a boastful way, but in a way that makes certain arguments instantly collapse. When an American explains global politics with the confidence of someone who's watched a few documentaries, they're sometimes gently reminded that Britain has been directly involved in those regions for centuries, for better or worse. Not as a flex, but as context. Context that's inconvenient. The backfire becomes unavoidable in classrooms. An American student challenges a British professor, arguing that the US system encourages more independent thinking. The professor listens patiently, nods, and then asks the student to explain the difference between critical thinking and confidence. It's not said cruelly, it's said academically. The room goes quiet. The student realizes too late that this isn't a debate show. It's a seminar. Even humor becomes a battlefield Americans don't realize they're losing. American humor often aims for clarity. The joke needs a punchline. British humor thrives in discomfort, understatement, and irony so dry it almost sounds serious. An American cracks a joke expecting laughter, and instead gets a polite smile. A Brit responds with something that sounds like agreement but is actually devastatingly sarcastic. The American nods along, not realizing they've just been roasted until someone explains it later. One of the most common backfires happens around intelligence. There's a persistent stereotype that British people sound smart because of their accents, not because they actually are. An American might joke that Brits just talk fancy. That's when the Brit switches registers entirely, dropping the accent slightly, pulling out references, vocabulary, and cultural knowledge that weren't being advertised before. Not to show off, but because they didn't think it was necessary earlier. And then there's the internet. Oh, the internet is where this dynamic truly shines. A viral clip shows an American confidently explaining British history to British commenters. Within minutes, the replies are filled with calm corrections, sourced references, and humor so subtle it goes unnoticed until the likes pile up. The American doubles down. The Brits don't. They wait. They let the algorithm do the rest. What Americans often miss is that British culture doesn't reward loud certainty, it rewards precision, restraint, self-awareness. So when an American speaks as though volume equals authority, it reads less like leadership and more like insecurity. That's not an insult. It's a cultural mismatch. One side is performing confidence. The other is quietly measuring it. The backfire becomes personal when Americans try to explain British society to Brits themselves. Things like class, education, or social mobility. An American might argue that Britain is rigid and outdated, that America is freer and more equal. A Brit might agree partially, then casually point out private schools, accents, and social cues that Americans don't even register. The American realizes they've been speaking in generalizations, while the Brit has been living in specifics. Even pop culture isn't safe. An American dismisses British television as slow or boring. Then someone mentions that many American shows are adapted from British originals. The Office, House of Cards, reality formats, comedy styles. The conversation shifts. The American laughs awkwardly. They hadn't connected those dots. The most painful backfires happen when Americans confuse friendliness with familiarity. Calling strangers by first names, oversharing, assuming shared values. In Britain, politeness has layers. An American might think they've bonded with someone, only to realize later that they were being politely tolerated, not embraced. When the truth becomes clear, it's not dramatic, it's quietly humiliating. None of this means Americans are unintelligent or arrogant by default. The problem isn't being American. It's assuming the American way is the universal upgrade. That assumption is what Britain dismantles with surgical calm, not through confrontation but through exposure, through letting Americans realize piece by piece that they walked into a room they didn't fully understand. And when the realization hits, it hits slowly. In the pub, when a British friend corrects a historical detail without breaking eye contact. In a debate, when the American realizes the other person hasn't been trying to win, just to be accurate. In a joke, when the laughter comes from everyone else. The final backfire isn't public embarrassment, it's internal. It's the moment an American realizes they've been mistaking confidence for competence, volume for authority, and familiarity for understanding, and that the people they assumed were behind have been patiently ahead the entire time. By the end, the smartest Americans don't feel angry, they feel educated, humbled, a little quieter. They start listening more, asking better questions, appreciating the fact that superiority isn't something you announce, it's something you never need to prove. And that's the real twist. Britain doesn't win these moments by trying to be superior. It wins by not trying at all. If you've ever seen one of these moments play out, or lived through one yourself, you already know how satisfying that silence can be. And if you haven't, you probably will now that you're paying attention. What makes these moments even more interesting is what happens after the realization sets in. Because once the initial confidence cracks, Americans often swing in the opposite direction. Suddenly, they're hyper-aware, listening more closely, replaying conversations in their heads, wondering how many times they confidently said something that sounded impressive but meant absolutely nothing to the people around them. This is when the learning curve really begins. Americans start noticing things they ignored before. How British conversations aren't about dominating the room, but navigating it. How disagreement doesn't require escalation. How sarcasm isn't meant to be loud or obvious, but sharp enough to cut quietly. And most importantly, how intelligence in Britain isn't worn like a badge, it's concealed until needed. There's a moment many Americans describe when they realize British people had clocked them from the start, the jokes, the pause.